Picture this. Bengaluru, a city humming with the energy of tech innovation and big dreams. And in this world, we meet Niharika Patel, 28. Stepping into this scene ready to make her mark. She was everything Bengaluru embodied. Vibrant, driven, a smile that just lit up every room.
You really captured the spirit of the city.
And then there's Raghav Kapoor, 30, already moving up in the corporate world. The quiet, competent type. Seemed to have it all figured out.
Yeah.
And their paths crossed at a busy tech firm. An office romance starts to blossom amidst the deadlines and presentations. Seems ordinary enough, right? But as their connection deepens, it starts to twist, to become something darker, more possessive.
That shift is always so fascinating and honestly a little frightening.
And then, in a conference room still buzzing from the workday, the unthinkable happens. This love story turns into a crime scene, leaves behind shattered lives and a city struggling to understand how something so familiar, so seemingly normal could go so terribly wrong.
A real tragedy.
It is. Welcome to CrimePod Castle's Twisted Love series. Today, we're diving deep into the Bengaluru Office Affair Tragedy, a case that really shook the city and forced everyone to confront the dark side of love and ambition.
You know what's really unsettling about this is that it could have been anywhere. This wasn't some dark alley. This happened right in the middle of a modern workplace, a place we associate with progress and productivity. And that's what's so chilling, the realization that the seeds of this kind of tragedy can be sown in the most ordinary places.
Yeah, it's almost like a crack appearing in this perfect picture, You think you understand what's real, what's safe, and then something like this happens. It shatters your whole sense of security.
Exactly. And that's why it's crucial to peel back those layers, to really understand human relationships, the complexities, and to recognize those subtle signs that often point toward tragedy.
So let's start by trying to get to know Niharika and Raghav a bit better. We know Niharika was a rising star in the marketing department, described as outgoing, ambitious. What else can you tell us about her? Her personality, her dreams, the things that made her tick.
From everyone who knew her, Niharika was a force of nature. She wasn't just climbing the ladder, she was building her own staircase, fueled by her passion for her work and this genuine desire to make a difference. She was the kind of person who could just walk into a room and instantly lift the energy, drew people in with her warmth and enthusiasm.
Sounds like someone you'd want on your team.
Absolutely.
And Raghav, he was a team leader, seen as dependable, capable, but what was going on beneath the surface? What were his motivations, his insecurities, the things that might have contributed to this awful turn of events?
That's where things get a bit more interesting, and we need to be cautious. It's easy to label Raghav as the villain here, but it's crucial to remember he's a complex individual with his own experiences, his own vulnerabilities, and maybe some deep-seated insecurities that might have fueled his actions. Remember, we're not here to justify what he did, but to understand the factors that might have led to this tragedy.
That's an important point. This isn't about placing blame or simplifying people into neat little boxes. It's about trying to understand the human story behind the headlines, the nuances that often get lost in the sensationalism of a crime like this.
You hit the nail on the head. And to do that, we need to really look at their relationship, the power dynamics, the unspoken expectations, and the simmering resentments that can build up beneath the surface of any romance, especially one that plays out in a high-pressure workplace.
Right. So let's delve into those dynamics. Their relationship started as a pretty typical office romance, the kind that sparked whispers by the water cooler. But at what point did that initial attraction morph into something more intense, more possessive?
That's the million-dollar question. As we put together the timeline of their relationship, we'll be looking for those little shifts in behavior, those warning signs that might have been missed or just dismissed as normal ups and downs of a new relationship. And try to understand how a simple office romance could spiral into something so destructive.
Right, and most of us have seen office romances, right? Maybe even been part of one ourselves.
Oh, yeah.
We understand the allure, that excitement of finding a connection in the middle of the daily grind. But this case makes you ask, what happens when that connection goes sour? When love turns into obsession?
It's a tough question.
And when the workplace, a place for collaboration, for achievement, becomes a breeding ground for jealousy and rage?
That's the core of our deep dive today. We're not just looking at a crime, we're dissecting a relationship, trying to understand those psychological undercurrents that lead to tragedy. And maybe, just maybe, we can gain some insights that help us see the warning signs, not just in others, but in ourselves too.
It's a sobering thought, but so important. Because let's face it, we all have blind spots. Those areas where our judgment gets clouded by emotions, by our own desires and fears. And sometimes it takes a story like this, as tragic as it is, to shake us out of our complacency and force us to look at those darker parts of human nature.
Couldn't agree more.
So let's start with the early stages of their relationship, those seemingly innocent moments that might hold the key to understanding what went wrong.
Okay.
What were their first impressions of each other? How did their colleagues see their connection? Were there any early signs, maybe overlooked at the time, that hinted at the turbulence ahead?
Sure.
Let's start by painting a picture of their first encounter. What was it about Niharika that drew Raghav in? Was it her energy, her ambition, or something else? Some spark that neither of them could control.
It's hard to say for certain what initially drew them together, but from what people have said, we know Niharika was instantly drawn to Raghav's quiet confidence and his reputation as a rising star in the company. It's possible she saw in him a kind of stability and direction that she admired.
And what about Raghav? What did he see in Niharika? Was it just her beauty and charm? Or something deeper?
It's likely that Raghav, who had always been so focused on his career, was captivated by Niharika's vibrant personality and her ability to effortlessly navigate social situations. She represented a side of life that he maybe hadn't fully explored, a world of spontaneity and connection that he found alluring.
So you have these two individuals drawn to each other for different reasons, their paths crossing in this bustling tech firm. Sounds like the perfect recipe for an office romance, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
That excitement of a new connection, the shared ambition, the stolen glances across the boardroom table.
And for a while, that's exactly what it was. They were the it couple. Their romance the source of a lot of speculation and gossip amongst their colleagues. But as we dig deeper, we'll see how this seemingly innocent flirtation started to take on a more complicated and ultimately dangerous dimension.
I'm curious about those early warning signs. What were some of those subtle shifts in behavior that might have hinted at trouble brewing beneath the surface? Any red flags that colleagues might have missed or dismissed as just normal relationship ups and downs?
One thing that stands out is a gradual change in Raghav's demeanor. Initially known for his calm and collected approach, he became increasingly possessive of Niharika, demanding her attention, often visibly agitated when she interacted with other colleagues, especially men.
That possessiveness, that need to control, it's like a big red flag, isn't it?
It is.
But in the context of a new relationship, especially one fueled by the intensity of a shared workplace, those warning signs can be easy to miss.
Exactly. And remember, these changes often happen slowly, making it hard for those around them to see how serious the situation is becoming. What might start as seemingly harmless jealousy can easily turn into controlling behavior and eventually something far more dangerous.
So those cracks are starting to show in this picture-perfect office romance. Raghav's possessiveness becomes more obvious, and you can only imagine the pressure it put on Niharika. How did she react to this change in his behavior? Did she confront him, confide in any of her colleagues?
Well, from what we can gather, Niharika initially tried to downplay Raghav's possessiveness as a sign of affection. She might have even been flattered by his intense interest at first. However, as his behavior became more controlling, she started feeling suffocated. She started pulling away, focusing more on work, and trying to create some distance.
Sounds like she was trying to reclaim her space, to assert her independence. But how did Raghav react to this? Did he respect her need for space, or did things escalate?
That's what we'll delve into next. We'll see how Raghav's inability to cope with Niharika's growing independence fueled his resentment, setting the stage for a confrontation that would have devastating consequences.
And that's where the story takes a really dark turn, right? We're moving beyond stolen glances and gossip into a territory where love becomes obsession and control. I think it's important for our listeners to understand this shift can happen in any relationship. It doesn't matter your age, your social status, or your background.
You're absolutely right. This isn't just about one incident in a tech firm in Bengaluru. It's about recognizing the patterns of abusive behavior that can appear in any relationship anywhere in the world. And by understanding these patterns, by learning to identify the red flags, we can empower ourselves and others to break free from toxic relationships before they escalate into tragedy.
A heavy topic, but crucial. And I think it's important for us to pause here and let our listeners absorb what we've discussed. When we come back, we'll delve into the events that led to that awful day in the conference room, the day Niharika's story was so tragically cut short. We'll examine the evidence, the eyewitness accounts, and try to understand what drove Raghav to such a horrific act.
Welcome back to CrimePod Castle's Twisted Love series. Before the break, we were talking about the early stages of Niharika and Raghav's relationship and how those first signs of possessiveness from Raghav began to change things.
We left off with Niharika trying to create some distance,
Uh,
sensing that Raghav's affection was becoming, well, suffocating. What happened next? Did he try to win her back? Did he respect her need for space? Or did his behavior get even worse?
That's where the story takes a darker turn. Instead of accepting Niharika's decision, Raghav's possessiveness just intensified.
Oh, wow.
He wouldn't let go. He bombarded her with calls and messages, constantly pleaded for another chance, and he even started confronting her at work. Yeah, creating these scenes that made everyone uncomfortable. He couldn't seem to grasp that the relationship was over.
It's a classic pattern, isn't it? That inability to let go, the desperation to regain control even when it's clear the other person wants to move on.
Exactly. And in Raghav's case, this desperation was fueled by rumors that Niharika had started seeing a junior colleague, a guy named Arjun Mehta.
Adding fuel to the fire.
Yeah. And whether these rumors were true or not almost doesn't matter. It just added to Raghav's jealousy and paranoia.
It's like throwing gasoline on an already smoldering fire.
Yeah.
The rumors, whether true or not, became a justification for his behavior, a confirmation of his fears.
Exactly. And that's where the whole workplace setting becomes even more dangerous, you know? Imagine the tension, the awkward encounters, the whispers and speculation among colleagues as Raghav's behavior became more and more erratic.
I bet.
It was a pressure cooker.
And for Niharika, trying to maintain her professionalism, focus on her work, while also dealing with the fallout of this toxic relationship playing out so publicly.
Must have been awful.
It must have been incredibly difficult.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that this kind of emotional turmoil can really impact someone's ability to do their job. It leads to distractions, stress, even fear, all of which can affect productivity and just create this hostile work environment for everyone.
Right, it's not just contained to those two.
Exactly.
It impacts everyone around them. So it makes you wonder about the company's role in all of this. Did they step in at all? Did they have any policies in place for these kinds of situations?
That was definitely a question that was heavily scrutinized after the tragedy. At the time, their policies on workplace relationships were, well, a bit vague. They discouraged relationships between superiors and subordinates, sure, but there weren't clear guidelines on how to deal with conflicts or address potential harassment that might come from these relationships.
So a bit of a gray area. A lack of clear protocols that might have contributed to the situation escalating.
You could say that.
Yeah. It's easy to see in hindsight how clearer guidelines and a more proactive approach from the company could have made a difference.
Absolutely. This case was a real wake-up call for a lot of companies, prompting them to reevaluate their policies and implement better systems for addressing workplace harassment and supporting employees going through relationship problems.
A tragic lesson, but an important one. It highlights how important it is to create a work culture that prioritizes open communication, clear boundaries, and support for those who might be struggling with personal issues that bleed into their professional lives.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay, so let's get back to the timeline. We've established that Raghav was struggling, his jealousy was growing, and his behavior was escalating. What were the specific events leading up to that day in the conference room? Were there any incidents that really foreshadowed the tragedy?
In the weeks leading up to it, there were several incidents that caused concern among colleagues. Raghav was seen confronting Niharika in the office, demanding explanations about her alleged relationship with Arjun Mehta. He became increasingly withdrawn and volatile. His work suffered, and his interactions with colleagues became strained.
It's like watching a pressure cooker about to explode. Yeah. You see the signs of distress getting more and more obvious. Were there any attempts to intervene, to get Raghav some help, or protect Niharika from his escalating behavior?
Sadly, no. While some colleagues did express concerns to supervisors, there was a general feeling of helplessness, like this isn't my business. No one wanted to overstep boundaries or get involved in what was seen as a personal matter. And as we said, the company didn't really have clear protocols for dealing with these situations.
Wow.
It's a tragic illustration of how silence and inaction, even with good intentions, can have terrible consequences. It shows how we all need to be more vigilant, to recognize those signs of distress in others, and to speak up even when it feels uncomfortable.
Right.
Sometimes the hardest thing is to step into someone else's personal life, especially when it's about a romantic relationship. But this case shows us that ignoring the warning signs of abuse, even in the name of respecting privacy, can have fatal consequences.
Right.
It's not always the right choice to stay out of it.
Absolutely. So let's talk about that day, July 20, 2022. What happened in that conference room? Can you paint a picture for our listeners using the evidence, the eyewitness accounts, and the security footage?
It was a Wednesday afternoon, pretty typical. Most people had gone home for the day, but Niharika and Raghav were still at the office working late on a project. At some point, Raghav asked Niharika to meet him in one of the smaller conference rooms. What started as a seemingly calm conversation quickly escalated into a heated argument.
Do we know what the argument was about? Was it
Yeah.
about the breakup? Arjun Mehta.
According to people who overheard parts of it, Raghav was confronting Niharika again about the rumors of her seeing Arjun. He accused her of betraying him, humiliating him in front of their colleagues.
Classic.
It's a tactic abusers use, isn't it? Shifting the blame, making the victim feel responsible for their own mistreatment.
Exactly. And it can be incredibly effective, especially when the abuser was initially seen as charming and trustworthy. It can make the victim question their own perceptions, doubt their own reality.
Yeah.
So, this argument is escalating. The tension is high. What happened next? How did it go from a verbal fight to a physical attack?
Security cameras in the hallway outside the conference room show Raghav becoming more and more agitated. He's pacing, his voice getting louder. At one point, he slams his fist on the table, startling Niharika.
You could feel the rage building.
Right. And then what happened next was captured on the conference room's internal security camera. In a sudden outburst of rage, Raghav grabbed a letter opener from the table and lunged at Niharika.
A letter opener.
Yeah.
Such an ordinary object, something you find in every office, transformed into a weapon. It's chilling how everyday things can be used for violence.
It really is. And the attack was brutal. He stabbed her multiple times. The force of his rage was clear in the ferocity of his actions.
It's a horrific image to imagine. This attack happening in a sterile corporate conference room. What happened next? Did anyone intervene?
Thankfully, yes. Two colleagues were working late in an office nearby and heard the commotion. They ran to the conference room and found Niharika on the floor bleeding heavily. Raghav was standing over her, still holding the letter opener.
Oh my gosh, what a horrifying thing to witness.
I can't imagine. The colleagues immediately called for help. Security and paramedics arrived within minutes.
And what about Raghav? What was his reaction when they came in? Did he try to run? Did he show any remorse?
According to them, Raghav seemed to snap out of his rage as soon as they entered. He dropped the letter opener, his face went pale, and his hands were shaking. He didn't resist arrest when security got there.
It's like the violence itself shocked him back to reality.
It's a common reaction in these cases. The adrenaline, the rage, fades, and they're left facing the consequences of what they've done.
So, Niharika is rushed to the hospital, Raghav's arrested, and the investigation begins.
Oh.
What evidence did the investigators focus on? What was the prosecution's strategy in building their case against Raghav?
They had a lot to work with. They had the eyewitness accounts from the colleagues who intervened, the security footage from both the hallway and the conference room, and the murder weapon itself. The letter opener had Niharika's blood and Raghav's fingerprints on it.
It's a lot of evidence. A very clear picture of what happened that night. What about Raghav's defense? How did they try to counter such a strong case?
They were facing a really tough challenge. Their strategy focused on portraying Raghav as a man driven to temporary insanity by the emotional turmoil of the breakup and the rumors about Niharika's alleged infidelity.
Trying to appeal to the jury's empathy, to paint him as a victim of circumstance rather than a cold-blooded killer.
Exactly. They argued that in his emotionally unstable state, Raghav wasn't capable of forming the intent to kill, that his actions were a result of a momentary lapse in judgment, a crime of passion, not a premeditated act.
But how did the prosecution respond to that? Did they present evidence to challenge the temporary insanity claim?
They did. They focused on the pattern of Raghav's controlling and possessive behavior leading up to the attack. They presented evidence of his escalating harassment of Niharika, his confrontations at work, his increasingly erratic behavior.
They were building a case that this wasn't a spontaneous act, but the culmination of a pattern of abusive behavior.
Exactly. They argued that his actions were a direct result of his inability to accept the end of the relationship and his obsession with controlling Niharika's life.
A powerful argument, one that directly challenges the defense's claim. Did the jury believe it? What was the verdict?
The trial went on for weeks. Both sides presented their arguments and witnesses. It was a high-profile case, captivating the media and the public. And in the end, the jury deliberated for days before reaching a verdict.
I bet the tension in the courtroom was palpable. So what was the verdict?
The jury found Raghav Kapoor guilty of murder. They didn't buy the temporary insanity defense. They concluded that his actions were deliberate and premeditated.
Guilty. A confirmation that his actions had consequences. that even in a moment of intense emotion, violence is never the answer.
Exactly. And the sentencing was just as intense. The prosecution pushed for the maximum penalty while the defense pleaded for leniency. They cited Raghav's previously clean record and his emotional distress as reasons for a lighter sentence.
So what was the sentence? How much time did he receive?
The judge, taking everything into consideration, sentenced Raghav Kapoor to life in prison.
Life in prison. A heavy sentence.
It is. And the judge, in his sentencing remarks, really highlighted the devastating impact of Raghav's actions, not just on Niharika and her family, but on the whole community. He talked about the need to send a strong message that violence, especially against women, won't be tolerated.
A powerful statement. It recognizes the broader societal implications of this tragedy. But this case goes beyond the legal consequences. It raises so many questions about love, obsession, the blurry lines between passion and violence.
Absolutely. And as we go deeper into this case, I think it's important to move past the courtroom drama and really explore the psychology behind it all.
Right, let's unpack those psychological factors. What are the warning signs of an obsessive personality? How can we tell the difference between healthy love and unhealthy obsession? And what can we do as individuals and as a society to prevent these tragedies from happening?
Those are all crucial questions, and we'll be addressing them in the next part of our deep dive. We'll explore the psychology of obsession, the red flags of abusive behavior, and the resources available for those who might be dealing with similar issues.
It's a complex and challenging topic, but we can't shy away from it. By understanding the roots of this tragedy, we can start to heal and prevent more heartbreak in the future. Welcome back to CrimePod Castle's Twisted Love series. We've been exploring the tragic story of Niharika Patel and Raghav Kapoor, an office romance that turned into a nightmare of obsession, control, and ultimately violence. We left off talking about the guilty verdict and Raghav's life sentence, a stark reminder that actions have consequences, especially when those actions result in the loss of a life.
It's so important to remember that this isn't just about a crime, it's about the lives that were changed forever by it. Niharika's family, her friends, her colleagues, they were left to deal with this unimaginable grief, a void that can never truly be filled.
It's just heartbreaking to think about the ripple effects of this tragedy, the pain that goes far beyond the courtroom. And what about the company? How did they handle the aftermath of such a horrific event happening in their own workspace?
The company faced a huge challenge after the tragedy. They had to deal with the emotional trauma their employees experienced, rebuild trust, and make changes to prevent something like this from ever happening again.
What kind of changes did they make? What steps did they take to create a safer and more supportive environment?
Well, one of the biggest changes was a complete overhaul of their policies regarding workplace relationships. They implemented really clear guidelines on dating between colleagues, especially those in supervisory roles, and established a zero-tolerance policy for any kind of harassment.
It's a recognition that office romances, while common, can create some tricky power dynamics and potential conflicts of interest. By setting clear boundaries, the company was trying to mitigate those risks.
Exactly. And that wasn't all. They also invested a lot in training programs for employees and managers. The focus was on recognizing the signs of unhealthy relationships, understanding domestic violence dynamics, and knowing how to report concerns and support colleagues who might be experiencing abuse.
Wow.
Yeah, they were really trying to cover all the bases.
It's a multifaceted approach. They're addressing both the structural and human elements of safety in the workplace. But what about the emotional well-being of the employees? How did they support those struggling to cope with the trauma?
Well, the company recognized that healing from something this traumatic takes time, and it requires ongoing support. They offered grief counseling services to everyone, provided paid leave for those who needed time to process their emotions, and created safe spaces for employees to talk about their feelings and connect with each other.
They acknowledged that trauma doesn't just vanish overnight. It takes time, compassion, and a real commitment to creating an environment where healing can happen. It sounds like they went above and beyond.
They really did. It wasn't just about avoiding legal trouble or protecting their image, There was a real sense of responsibility, a desire to learn from this and prevent it from ever happening again.
Yeah. It shows that even in the face of tragedy, there's a chance for growth, for learning, for turning something awful into something positive.
Absolutely. And this case is a powerful reminder that we all have a role to play in making workplaces safer and healthier. It's not just about rules and policies. It's about fostering a culture of respect, empathy, and open communication.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into this case, I'd like to shift our focus to our listeners. What are some key takeaways they can apply to their own lives, their relationships, their workplaces?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is to be aware of those red flags, those warning signs of unhealthy relationships. We often hear about them in romantic relationships, but they can apply to any relationship, friendships, family, even work relationships.
So what are some of those red flags? What should people be watching out for?
Some common ones are possessiveness, controlling behavior, jealousy, isolation from friends and family, constantly needing reassurance. Remember, these behaviors can be subtle at first, but they can get worse over time.
Like a slow poison, eroding trust and self-esteem until the person feels trapped.
That's a great way to put it. And that's why it's crucial to act early, to set boundaries, and to get help if you or someone you know is experiencing these kinds of things.
Where can people turn for help? What resources are available for those dealing with unhealthy relationships or experiencing abuse?
There are a lot of amazing organizations dedicated to supporting victims of domestic violence and promoting healthy relationships. We'll be sure to include links to some of those resources in our show notes.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
And it's so important to emphasize that getting help is a sign of strength, not weakness. It takes real courage to admit you need support, to reach out when you're struggling.
Couldn't agree more. No one should have to go through this alone. There are people who care and want to help.
So as we close this chapter on this tragic story, I want to leave our listeners with a message of hope. This case might show the terrible consequences of unchecked obsession and violence, but it also reminds us how important human connection, empathy, and speaking up are.
Absolutely. We can all make a difference by being more aware, more compassionate, and more willing to step in when we see signs of trouble. Even a small act of kindness can make a difference, creating a safer and more supportive world for everyone.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of CrimePod Castle's Twisted Love series. We encourage you to keep the conversation going, share your thoughts, and stay vigilant. And as always, don't forget to follow and subscribe to CrimePod Castle and our YouTube channel for more deep dives into true crime stories.